The evening started like any other, casual, laid back, and filled with a familiar hum of polite conversation. My wife and I arrived at the dinner party, and I quickly slipped into the role of the quiet, observant husband. Her business world was always a bit outside mine, filled with sharp minds and high stakes, but I had always managed to hold my own, until tonight. David, a business associate of my wife, was there as usual. He had this way about him, a confident grin, the kind that always seemed to linger just a little too long. At first, I thought it was nothing more than the usual banter, harmless jests tossed my way. But as the evening wore on, his comment began to feel sharper, almost deliberate. He mocked my job, my interests, even my mannerisms, all under the guise of a joke. The laughs from the others felt forced, too, as though they were just playing along. My wife, sitting beside me, looked amused, but I saw the subtle shift in her eyes, a brief, almost apologetic glance, as if she didn't know how to stop him. Every remark hit harder than the last, each one more cutting, more pointed. I tried to laugh it off, to shrug it away as I had done countless times before. But this time, something inside me began to stir, a growing sense of frustration and helplessness. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as I realized that David wasn't just joking. He was belittling me, trying to prove something, to elevate himself at my expense. The mockery wasn't accidental. It was calculated. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it felt like my silence was feeding into it. I wanted to say something, to stand up for myself, but I held back, unsure if it would make things worse. The suspense built with every passing moment, and deep down, I knew something had to change. But what could I do? I wasn't sure, not yet. The drive home was eerily quiet. My wife, who usually filled the car with chatter, sat beside me, her fingers tracing absent-mindedly over her phone. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur by, feeling like an outsider in my own life. My mind replayed the dinner, David's words, his smirk, the uncomfortable laughter of the guests. But it wasn't just the mocking that lingered. It was the silence that followed. I could feel the tension in the air between my wife and me, though neither of us said a word. I wanted to scream, to unleash all the frustration that had been building inside me all night. But every time I tried to voice it, the words caught in my throat. How could I explain it to her? How could I tell her that the man she worked with, the one she called a friend, had made me feel so small, so invisible? We pulled into the driveway, and the silence followed us inside. I dropped my coat on the chair, mindlessly kicking off my shoes as I headed for the kitchen. My wife didn't follow, and that hurt more than I expected. I needed her to see it, to understand what had just happened. I needed her to see me, not just a quiet, unassuming husband who always smiled politely, but the person who was being humiliated right in front of her. After a few moments, she appeared in the doorway, standing in her work clothes, still pristine and professional. While I felt disheveled and defeated, she hesitated before speaking, her voice almost too soft. "Are you okay?" The question felt empty. I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay all night. But how could I explain the depth of what had happened without sounding petty or insecure? How could I make her understand that this wasn't about a few passing jokes, but about respect, or the lack of it? "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "It's nothing." She studied me for a long moment, but then, like so many times before, she let it go. She didn't press. I stood there, the weight of the evening settling over me. This wasn't just about David. It wasn't just about the mocking or the insults. It was about everything that had led to this moment. The feeling of being overlooked, of being ignored in my own relationship. I want to say something, to finally stand up for myself. But the words didn't come. The house was quiet. The stillness felt oppressive, as if the silence had been growing, waiting for the right moment to explode. I stood in the living room, pacing back and forth, my mind a storm conflicting thoughts. David's mocking laughter echoed in my head, his smirk flashing in my mind like an unwanted memory. I couldn't shake it, couldn't ignore it anymore. I had let it slide for too long, his arrogance, his constant need to belittle me, and the way everyone, including my wife, just let it happen. Not anymore, I thought. I was done being the quiet, passive one who took the hits. No one was going to mock me. Not again. It wasn't like I had ever been the type to back down from confrontation. But there was something different about this. Maybe it was the way David had made me feel small in front of everyone, or the way my wife had dismissed it as just David being David. It all built up inside me until I couldn't take it anymore. This ends now. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and dialed David's number. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment. The fear of what might happen, of how he would react, almost made me stop. But no, I had already let this go for too long. The phone rang, and my heart pounded in my chest. Each ring felt like a countdown, the seconds stretching longer than they should. When he finally picked up, I could hear the casualness in his voice, as though nothing had happened, as though it was just another regular conversation. "Hey, man, what's up?" David's voice was almost too chipper, too relaxed. He probably thought he was untouchable. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "David, we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear the shift in his tone, the casualness starting to fade. Sure. What about?" I felt a flicker of strength. "About the way you treated me at dinner last night. You made me feel like a joke, and I'm not going to let that slide anymore." David's laughter was the first response I got. It was dismissive, condescending. "Oh, come on, man. It was just some harmless jokes. Don't take it so seriously." His words hit me like a slap, but I didn't back down. "It wasn't harmless. You were mocking me, making fun of my career and the things that matter to me. And the worst part is, everyone laughed along, including my wife. You think that doesn't hurt? You think I don't notice when I'm the butt of your jokes?" There was silence on the other end. For a moment, I wondered if he was going to brush it off, tell me I was overreacting again. But when he spoke next, there was a noticeable change in his voice. "Look, I didn't mean it like that. I was just, well, you know me. I joke around. I didn't mean to hurt you, man." It wasn't the apology I wanted, but it was something. He was acknowledging that he had gone too far. But I wasn't done. "No, David," I said, my voice firm now. "It wasn't just joking around. You've been doing this for months. Every time we hang out, you find a way to make me feel small. You need to understand that I'm not okay with that. I'm not going to let you walk all over me anymore. I'm done with it." Another long pause, and then the quietest apology I'd ever heard. I didn't realize it bothered you that much. I'm sorry." The words were awkward, but they carried weight. For the first time in a long while, I felt heard. It wasn't the clean, clear-cut resolution I had imagined, but it was progress. I had stood up for myself, and that was all that mattered. When I hung up the phone, I felt lighter. There was no immediate satisfaction, no rush of triumph, but there was something even better: peace. I didn't need to prove anything to David. I had proven it to myself. For the first time in years, I had taken control of my own narrative, and that felt damn good. The moment I hung up the phone, I exhaled like I had been holding my breath for years. The silence in the room was deafening, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a pause, a moment to process everything that had just happened. I couldn't quite explain it. There was no sense of euphoria, no immediate rush of relief, but there was peace. It was a quiet peace, as if the storm inside me had finally settled. I had expected some sort of instant victory, but there was none. David had apologized, yes, but the words didn't feel like a triumphant win. Instead, they felt like a necessary acknowledgement of the hurt I had been carrying for so long. He heard me. That was all I needed to know. But as I stood there, the weight of what had just transpired started to sink in. I had spoken up. I had made my voice heard. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something I didn't even realize I had lost, a sense of self-respect. It wasn't about proving anything to David anymore. It was about proving something to myself. For too long, I had kept my silence, thinking that silence would protect me or keep the peace. But it had only built walls between me and the person I was supposed to be. I looked at the phone in my hand, almost like it was an artifact from a different world. I realized how long I let others, including David, dictate how I felt about myself. It was as if that one phone call had shattered the glass ceiling I'd unknowingly built over my own life. When I walked into the living room to find my wife sitting on the couch, I noticed a subtle shift in the air. She looked up, eyes wide, a mix of surprise and curiosity in her gaze. "What happened?" she asked, her voice uncertain. I felt an odd sense of calm when I replied. "I called David. I told him how I felt about last night." Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way she paused that made me realize how much this moment meant for both of us. There was no immediate apology from her, no explanation, but she didn't need to say anything. The conversation with David had shifted something between us, too. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was invisible or irrelevant in my own life. The tension that had weighed on me for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was enough. The days that followed the phone call felt strange, like I was walking through a new version of my life. There wasn't the dramatic fallout I had expected. No storm of angry messages or confrontations. In fact, David's behavior after our conversation was oddly subdued. At the next business gathering, he avoided me, keeping his distance with the kind of awkwardness that only someone who knew they'd crossed a line could muster. I caught glimpses of him glancing my way, as if waiting for me to say something more, but I stayed silent. He didn't apologize again, and I didn't need him to. The power had shifted, and that was enough. But the real change wasn't in how David acted. It was in how I felt. I felt different, stronger. The weight I had carried for so long had lifted. But it wasn't just about standing up to David anymore. It was about realizing that I had the right to take up space, to defend myself, and to demand respect. For years, I had quietly accepted the role of the nice guy, the one who let slights slide off, who stayed quiet in uncomfortable situations, who played the role of the obedient husband and passive friend. But after that phone call, I couldn't be that person anymore. It was a sobering realization. I had spent so much time trying to avoid conflict, trying to keep the peace at all costs, that I had sacrificed my own sense of self in the process. I had been afraid to speak up, to be seen as confrontational or difficult. But now I understood that avoiding confrontation wasn't always the best way to keep the peace. Sometimes peace had to be fought for, not by aggression, but by standing firm in your truth. And I had learned to do just that. The change in me was noticeable. At work, I found myself more assertive. In conversations, I no longer allowed myself to be bulldozed. I spoke up when I disagreed, and I didn't shy away from difficult conversations. It wasn't that I suddenly became arrogant or combative. It was more like I had finally found my voice, one that had been drowned out by years of keeping quiet. Even in my marriage, things began to shift. My wife, who had once brushed off my frustrations as just the way David was, began to see me in a different light. It wasn't that she hadn't cared before, but I don't think she fully understood how much I had been hurting. As I became more confident in myself, I became more confident in our relationship. I stopped accepting half-hearted apologies and explanations, and we began to have more honest, open conversations. One evening, as we sat on the couch, her hand resting on mine, she said, "You were right about David. I should have seen it. I should have said something sooner." It wasn't the apology I had been waiting for, but it was something even better, a recognition of my feelings, a mutual respect that hadn't been there before. The lesson I learned wasn't just about standing up to someone else. It was about standing up for myself, about understanding that my worth wasn't tied to other people's opinions, and that silence wasn't always the best option. Sometimes, speaking out, even when it's uncomfortable, is the only way to regain your power. In the end, I realized that David wasn't the problem. The real issue had been me, allowing myself to be overlooked, letting his mockery slide, and thinking that silence would bring me peace. It didn't. The peace came from within, from the moment I found the courage to speak up. Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when things started to change. It wasn't a single moment or a dramatic shift. It was a gradual realization, a quiet transformation that unfolded over time. But when I think about who I was before that phone call and who I am now, the difference is undeniable. Before, I had been someone who let things slide, someone who wore the mask of the nice guy to avoid confrontation. I was a husband who didn't want to rock the boat, the friend who bit his tongue, the person who lived in the shadow of others' expectations. I convinced myself that keeping the peace meant avoiding conflict at all costs, that standing up for myself was somehow selfish or unnecessary. But now I see how wrong I was. Standing up to David wasn't just about confronting his mockery. It was about confronting my own fears. Fear of rejection. Fear of being labeled as difficult or confrontational. Fear of making waves in relationships. But with that one phone call, I had shattered those fears. I had taken back control of my life. That phone call was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, I felt like I was seeing the world through a new lens. I wasn't afraid to speak up anymore. I wasn't afraid to assert my worth. The power of self-respect started to ripple through every area of my life, my work, my friendships, and most importantly, my marriage. My wife noticed a change, too. She didn't come out and say it right away, but there was a new energy between us. Our conversations became more honest, more direct. The walls that had been built from years of unspoken frustrations started to crumble. We were able to talk about things we had avoided for years, about the things that truly mattered to us both. I no longer felt like I was invisible or like my feelings didn't matter. She began to see me in a new light, not as a passive, silent partner, but as someone with a voice that deserved to be heard. As for David, things were never quite the same. He remained distant at work events, and while we never had a heart-to-heart about what happened, I didn't need one. The power had shifted. He had seen me stand up for myself, and I knew, deep down, that he respected me for it. In that moment, I realized something crucial. Respect isn't given, it's earned. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was real. I learned that true peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from facing it head-on and having the courage to stand firm in your truth. I had taken control of my narrative, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free.